Jill Widner grew up in Sumatra, Indonesia, the setting of her novel in progress, Green Raft on a Muddy Swell, where her father worked as a petroleum engineer in the 1960s. Her fictions appeared in many prestigious American outlets, such as the Kenyan Review, Wasafiri, Shenandoah, American Short Fiction, and other places. She's been the recipient of grants and fellowships from Artists Trust, Hawthornton Castle, the MacDowell Colony, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and Yaddo. She's a graduate of the Iowa Writers' Workshop and currently lives and teaches in Yakima, Washington. Would you please welcome Jill Widner.
I always forget when I come to this part of the world that I'm the one who has the accent, so I hope you can bear with me. Thank you so much, Patrick Cotter and Billy O'Callaghan, and especially James O'Leary for giving such close reading of my manuscript. So I'm going to read a story called Yalda Zhila, an excerpt from the middle story of my chapbook. Before I knew Yalda, I used to stand at the railing in front of her apartment window because it looked directly over the pool. I had seen a girl about my age standing at the glass watching me through the transparent curtains. At least I liked to think she was watching me, but maybe she was just waiting as I was for Mrs. Bigelow, the manager, to unlock the gate to the pool. When we eventually met, I asked her if she'd ever seen horses in the canyon or heard children singing. She stared at me as if to say, not every question deserves an answer. She could be like that. She was old for her age. She said she was 14, but I think she was still 13 that summer, 13 going on 14. One night we were standing at the railing in front of Yalda's window, looking down at the pool. It was after 9, her mother was out. I think that was the night she asked me if I wanted to know what her name meant in English. Before I had a chance to say if I did or I didn't, she told me, "It means the longest night of the year." I stared at her blankly. "Have you never heard of the winter solstice?" I shrugged. "I guess I have." The winter solstice marks the day of the year with the fewest hours of daylight. I was conceived on the solstice, the 21st day of December. I could tell by the way she looked at me that she was testing me, but as usual, I didn't understand what the test was. "The shortest day of the year must have the longest night," she said. Her eyes were impatient. "That's the other reason my parents named me Yalda. Don't you get it?" I didn't say anything. Never mind. I thought she was tired of me and was going to go inside, but then she told me that Mrs. Bigelow kept a spare key to the locked gate beneath one of the buckets of chlorine crystals behind the pool shed. We had to stand for a few seconds in the security floodlight that beamed down from the roof. I watched the green-lit surface of the pool rippling in the spotlight while Yalda pressed the key into the padlock. It was a smooth fit, smooth the way the water was smooth that seemed warmer at night when I touched it. As we stood in the dark behind the diving board, pulling our t-shirts over our swimsuits, I asked her why her mother called me Zhila. I thought it was her way of pronouncing the G at the front of my name, which was Jillian, with a kind of French accent and what seemed to be an Iranian habit of adding an ah sound to the end of a word. But Yalda said it was the name of a river. A river? That's all? That's all. Why would she call me after a river? Because you're so quiet, Yalda said. My mother said the Zhila is a quiet river and very slow. What she really meant, at least what I like to think she meant, was that I was slow. Maybe they were right. That night, the lower half of my body floated in the deep end of the pool while the back of my head rested on the edge of the deck. And I watched while Yalda stood on the diving board and threw the spare key into the deep end. It was a reckless thing to do. She didn't have goggles. If she couldn't find it, we'd be caught. But she always found it, even with her eyes closed. Over and over, I watched her dive down to touch the bottom of the pool. Bubbles rose ahead of her face, and her long dark hair lifted and fell like riverweed brilliantly green in the floodlit water. When she surfaced, she gulped at the air for a breath. I had stroked to the center of the deep end by then. We were facing each other, treading water in the dark, our eyes resting just above the surface. Then, instead of looking away, as I usually did when she looked into my eyes, I looked back, and what I saw in her eyes for the first time was that I might be worthy of her friendship. She stroked back to the diving board, talking as she swam, as if she had said nothing to insult me, as if being quiet were nothing to be ashamed of, as if it were, in fact, a quality that she admired. Do you want to come over? I hadn't wanted to, but I had nothing else to do, so I followed Yalda back to her apartment. She was already inside when I reached the door. I watched her through the kitchen window, leaning over the plates and glasses stacked at the bottom of the sink, splashing her face and the back of her neck, gulping the water that was cupped in her hands. She was supposed to wash the dishes before her mother came home. She was supposed to keep the front door locked, but Yalda didn't much do what she was supposed to do. Shall I introduce you to the members of the family we left behind? I followed Yalda into the living room where she stood in front of what she called the étagère, the stack of shelves that held what was left of the mementos her mother had brought from Iran. She pronounced the word étagère the French way, which she had already told me several times she spoke fluently, and pointed to the faces in the ivory-framed photographs positioned like a shrine on the lowest shelf. This is my mother as a girl. These are my mother's sisters. And these, I suppose, are my cousins. To think we might have been friends. The tall man standing behind the chair is my grandfather, my mother's father. We lived with him for a time in Shiraz. The man in the chair wearing the white turban is my grandfather's father, my great-grandfather. What about your father? Don't you have pictures of him? My father? If there were any photographs of my father, my mother would have burned them. I haven't seen my father since we left Iran. My mother forbids me to speak of him, so I don't. I wanted to open the small painted boxes on the shelf above the photographs. What about these? These, Yalda said, are made of papier-mâché. This word she also pronounced the French way. The boxes were black and just the right size to hold in my hand. One was slightly longer than the others. The lid of the larger one was painted with red-faced flowers and yellow birds with yellow beaks and long yellow tail feathers. I was already thinking of the things I could hide inside the box if it were mine. The surface of the smaller box was painted with people dressed in orange robes gathered in a garden. You can recognize the difference between the men and the women by their headgear, Yalda said. The women wear chadors, the men wear turbans. In the old days, the turbans came in all different shapes and sizes. Some were decorated with long trailing tassels and adorned with jewels and peacock feathers or ostrich feathers. Others were embroidered with yellow finches, like the ones on these boxes, and small quail with crested head plumes. There are coins in this one, she said, opening it for me to glimpse inside before she snapped the lid closed again. What's inside the box with the yellow birds? Yalda looked as if she couldn't remember and pried the lid open to check. Only a piece of paper. I could see handwriting scrawled in pencil across a narrow sheet of graph paper. What does it say? Sahar Jazin. It's someone's name. Gold and silversmith, she translated. She closed the lid to change the subject. We didn't always live like this, she said, looking over her shoulder at the formica table, pushed under the kitchen window, the dishes stacked in the sink. Then out of nowhere, as if the memory of a dream had just then crossed her mind, she said, my grandfather used to hide quail eggs in his turban. Your grandfather wore a turban? Of course, didn't you notice his turban in the photograph? Why did he hide quail eggs in his turban? It was a game. Quail eggs are very small. Yalda held her thumb and forefinger apart. 4 or 5 of them could fit easily inside this pencil case. I'll show you. Yalda pulled a bar stool from the kitchen in front of the étagère and climbed on top of it. Resting on the highest shelf, a bird's nest was pushed away from the edge, out of sight. She lifted it down carefully and set it on the chest in front of the couch. It was an ordinary bird's nest made of twigs and dried grass. Maybe because of its shape, or maybe because the grass was wound around and around on itself, it reminded me of the turbans she had described. Inside, 6 quail eggs rested like 6 spotted stones. Each was different from the next. Some were pure white, some were pale brown white. Some of the spots were points, like freckles. Others looked like splotches of spilled ink. The shells are very old and very fragile. I'm not supposed to touch them. When we lived in my grandfather's house in Shiraz, he made a great ceremony of coming home at the end of the day. I remember him entering the house wearing a heavy wool coat that reached past his knees. I always thought of his coat as the robe an emperor would wear in a fairy tale. My grandmother had died years before, and my mother worked in an office, so an old woman looked after me during the day. But she was very stern. She couldn't read, and she didn't like to play games, so I spent my time in my imagination, or I looked out the window, or at pictures in books. When my grandfather walked through the door, I would run to him and wrap my arms around his knees. He was very tall. I remember thinking of the dark space under his coat as a kind of fortress, and there I would hide until he coaxed me out to play the game. It was something like hide and seek. I was to turn my back and cover my eyes while he went into the kitchen to hide the quail eggs he had brought home from the market in the folds of his turban. Then I had to search for them with my fingers. My mother says my grandfather invented the game because I was slow to speak. Quail eggs, it was believed at the time, would help children who were late talkers to express themselves. But it wasn't that I couldn't speak. I didn't have a speech impediment. I just didn't want to talk. I'm that way, I said. I can be. My mother says being too quiet makes a person look dumb. She said people who are unable to speak are called dumb. Mute, Yalda said. And then, as was often the case, she turned the conversation back to herself. The game had rules. Each egg I pulled out of his turban, I had to assign a word. What kind of a word? I asked him with my eyes. Anything you like, his eyes said back. Look around the room. Open your book. And so I pointed, and he would say the word, and I would repeat it, and the sound that came out of my mouth rose like a shape in the air. Sometimes when Yalda's mother was out late, and late for Yalda's mother sometimes meant all night, I spent the night with her. We closed the curtains and locked the front door and slept together in her mother's wide double bed. But we never went to sleep right away. Yalda liked to talk to me about her life in Shiraz before she moved to California, but only in the dark. Maybe her memory was clearer in the dark. Whatever it was, she told me things in the dark that she wouldn't have ordinarily revealed about herself. I don't think she realized that it gave me a kind of advantage. In my grandfather's house, there was a small door in the living room wall that opened into a kind of cellar, she told me one night. It wasn't an ordinary cellar, it was a cistern where the household water was stored. How did the water get inside the cistern? The rain. We drank rainwater. I washed my hair in rainwater. The door in the wall was the size of a tea tray. It was made of wood, and you turned a small metal latch to open it. If you leaned your head inside, you could see that the cistern was the size of a room, a cold, dark room. The water didn't fill the room, and you couldn't see to the bottom, but sometimes you could hear a sound like water lapping against the limestone wall. I didn't like to open the door in the wall. I used to imagine a drowned girl in a white dress lying half submerged at the bottom of a well. I could even see a ribbon floating with her long black hair in the rainwater. I think I thought she was me, or what was going to become of me. I didn't tell Yalda, but when she described the girl's hair floating in the water, I saw her hair, green as riverweed, lifting and falling in the floodlight, the way it had looked the time we went night swimming. Sometimes I thought I heard another sound. I thought it was the drowned girl's head knocking against the limestone wall. Did you tell anyone about the girl in the cistern? Not until now, she said. Then she took my hand in hers and held it between her ear and the pillow until she fell asleep. The clock on the radio beside her mother's bed was illuminated, blue numbers on an orange face. I watched the minute hand circle the clock until it was after 2 a.m. I wanted a drink of water. I filled a glass at the kitchen sink and took a sip. I dried my hands on a tea towel and looked from the bar stool, pushed under the counter to the swath of light the security floodlights projected onto the living room wall. I watched my shadow move across the wall as I carried the bar stool towards the shelf of mementos. What I really wanted to take was the papier-mâché box painted with the yellow birds, but there were only 3 boxes. A box would be too easy to miss. I stood on the stool and reached for the next on the highest shelf. The nest on the highest shelf. Did anyone really know there were exactly 6 eggs inside of it? If weeks or months from now, after I'd returned to Cincinnati, when Yalda or her mother looked in the nest, would they even notice one was missing? I didn't think they would. I reached cautiously into the nest and remembered how the winding layers of grass and string and twigs had seemed like the turbans Yalda had described, and I imagined Yalda's 3-year-old fingers reaching inside the folds until they bumped against one of the quail eggs. My touch was not so delicate. The first shell crushed into papery shards. I used only the tips of my fingers to lift the second egg out of the nest. I remembered seeing an extra large bottle of aspirin in the medicine cabinet and carried the quail egg balanced on the palm of my hand into the bathroom. I closed the door and listened for Yalda before I turned on the light. The cap came off easily, and as I'd guessed, there was a thick wad of cotton pressed down on the tablets inside. The quail egg, resting beside the sink, looked like a small potato, speckled with a constellation of black stars. I pulled the cotton apart and made a nest for the egg between the layers. My overnight bag was unzipped on the floor where I'd left it. I hid the aspirin bottle inside and slipped back into bed beside Yalda. Sometimes at night, I hold Yalda's quail egg in my mouth and wait in the dark to see if it has given me the courage yet to say what I think. Sometimes while I'm waiting, in my mind, I write Yalda a letter. It always ends the same way. Maybe I just wanted to say to you what you said to me so many times with your eyes. Not every question deserves an answer. Thank you.